Okay. So today, what we will try and again understand is some parts of what is understood as the history of analytical philosophy, and then we'll take one particular philosopher and some of his writings and development, and that I think for all of you, because you have been reading it as part of your course, A.J. Ayer. So we'll do something of A.J. Ayer because he's more familiar to you, all of you. Now, as we were mentioning about the history of analytical philosophy and characteristics of analytical philosophy, we saw certain key features of analytical philosophy: a great emphasis on logic, a great emphasis on philosophy of language, a somewhat suspicion of metaphysics, a great emphasis on science and scientific development. These are some of the features which seem to be identifying, and the major idea was that we are analyzing concepts. Now, analytical philosophy is sometimes seen as developing in two phases. The first phase is marked, as we said yesterday, by the philosophy of logical atomism of Bertrand Russell. And the other important book of the same kind is, again, the book which is part of your course, is Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So the metaphysics of logic is exposed, and there is much discussion on intentionality of signs. Nature of logic is then given, that logic is actually vacuous. And then there is a cartographic delineation showing that philosophy is not science. The limits of language and the limits of thought are discussed. So the limits of my thought are the limits of my language, the famous phrase of Ludwig Wittgenstein. After the First World War, historically, there were mainly two branches. One which is identified as the Cambridge analysis, and the other is the position which is generally called logical positivism. Cambridge analysis, as we all know, had its source in the writings of G.E. Moore, Russell, and Tractatus. There were discussions on notions like sense datum, meaning, where Moore very self-consciously moved to linguistic analysis. You know that how I think it's part of your course, you have 3 essays of G.E. Moore. One is on the proofs for the external world, then the other is on certainty, and there's a third one which is on in defense of common sense. Now, in all of them, especially if you are looking at his rejection of idealism, how is he rejecting idealism? By looking at the statement esse est percipi and saying that if you interpret it in one particular way, then what are the implications? If you interpret it in another particular way, then what are the implications? And if you interpret it in a third way, and in all the 3 ways, the implications seem to be not acceptable, and therefore the idea that to be is to be perceived, and from that Berkeley's idea of idealism, which follows, is actually not shown to be false, but shown to be meaningless. And this is in fact a very important thing which you have to understand. When Aristotle is addressing Plato or many other people who are rejecting Plato's idealism, they are showing that idealism is wrong or false or not correct. But when Moore is analyzing esse est percipi, he is saying that esse est percipi is meaningless. It is non-formulable, non-articulable. So not the question of being right and wrong, etc. And that, I think, is a very important kind of a difference which we need to notice in the method of philosophizing, that these people who are analyzing it through language and through linguistic analysis or using linguistic tools are now very self-consciously not talking about reality directly, as it were. Now, logical reduction, logical construction, they are discussed by many philosophers like Frederick Ramsay, Braithwaite, John Wisdom, and they were all very, very deeply influenced by the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein as represented in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. The younger philosophers, as I was mentioning yesterday, were very excited. The older scholars were appalled by the non-cognitive conception of philosophy, because earlier everybody thought that philosophy is going to give us truth. Philosophy is Tattva Vidya, Atma Vidya, etc. So it will tell us about truth. But now they are saying that no, philosophy is not going to give us truth, but at best it is going to give us meaning, and through that you will have understanding. So as I was mentioning yesterday, that they were saying that science will give you truth and philosophy will give you meaning. The other stream, as I said, different from the Cambridge analysis, which draws its origin from Moore, was logical positivism, and the center had moved now to Germany, Poland and Vienna, and they abandoned logical atomism, they abandoned the ontology of simple facts, rejected the distinction of showing and saying, and the whole idea that there can be one structure of all language is also rejected. And they accepted 4 or 5 major things. 1, philosophy is a non-cognitive science. 2, they accepted the demolition of metaphysics. 3, they accepted the principle of verification. 4, they accepted something which is called consistent empiricism, denying, as we were mentioning yesterday, synthetic a priori judgments. And one thing which I think should excite you is that the whole idea of unity of sciences, because at that time they were thinking that we can find a principle which unifies all sciences. 1945 saw a shift to Oxford, and as I mentioned yesterday, people like Weizmann, Grice, Hart, Hampshire, Berlin, Strawson, Urmson, Charles Peirce, Anthony Quinton, Warnock, all of them now are there in Oxford. What a time and what a place. So, and again, as I was mentioning yesterday, then you have Strawson coming up with Individuals in 1959, where the most general features of things are expounded in terms of descriptive metaphysics. And this was an analysis of ordinary language, and the linguistic turn at this time is supposed to have been completely taken. The use theory of language becomes very popular, that the meaning of the term is the use of the term, and Davidson was giving theories of meaning and truth. Quine dramatically spoke of naturalizing epistemology, and what was being earlier said that philosophy is different from science, by this time Quine is again, by naturalization of epistemology, showing that philosophy is also an extension of science. Now this is of course a very, very sketchy account of the history of analytical philosophy, and also the characteristics that I have given you are very sketchy, but this is only to build up an introduction for what we are now going to do, which is actually to read Quine, especially his rejection of analytic synthetic distinction as it appears in 2 Dogmas of Empiricism, and then other things. Also we can look at certain other things, but as I promised, I think one other figure who's generally read in most of the Indian universities and still remains very popular is A.J. Ayer. And as we were mentioning yesterday, Ayer comes to Oxford in 1929, gets his degree in 33, and he is coming at the time when Wittgenstein is teaching there. Quine is again an important figure at that time, and one of the important things which I think I would like to call your attention to is that these people at that time were discussing very important things, that what is to count as an observation statement. Now when I see, what do I see? Do I see the sense data of blueness? Do I see a blue box? What am I sensing? The box or the sensor? Or what? And if we are actually talking about sense impressions, then where are the sense impressions? Are they on the tip of my finger, or the end of my visual field, or inside the brain where I get to see, as it were, the blue box? If you talk about sense impressions are not objects. Sense impressions are impressions. And where are they impressions? In the mind. What is mind? Not the brain. Or mind in the brain is something which you have to argue about. So many of these discussions seem to be giving you some kind of an uncertainty that if you will concentrate too much on sense impressions and sensations, then you might actually go to idealism. So, do I see colors and shapes, or do I see objects? Do I infer objects, or do I directly see them? Ayer was part of these discussions, and then he writes a paper at that time, a very interesting paper, which is called Demonstration of the Impossibility of Metaphysics, and this was published in The Mind. Another very important philosopher whom you read as part of your social political philosophy, Isaiah Berlin, encouraged Ayer to write a book, and it is on this encouragement that Ayer finally writes the book, which is called Language, Truth and Logic, which he finished in 18 months. Of course, it's an interesting fact that it did not succeed very much when it was published, but that's true for most philosophers. Most of like even Marx was not very popular in his own times. Many great writers are not recognized in their own times. Buddha and Buddhism, there's a difference of something like 50 years after his death. Then the first Buddhist council happens, and then Yusuf. So much the same happens with Language, Truth and Logic. It does not become very popular immediately, and only 500 copies were sold at that time. It became very popular later, and young people like that. And I think all young people also now like Language, Truth and Logic very much, because it's very exciting. It tells you that no, there are only two types of statements, empirical statements, and the rest of the statements are not meaningful. So all metaphysics, religion, history of philosophy, etc., sab kuch bekar. So it becomes very good excuse for the young people not to read anything else, because they say ki jab verifiable hai nahi tab bekar hai, to padhne se koi fayda nahi. It gives you a justification for all your inactivity and laziness, and you are thrilled. Because it was saying that all history of philosophy and its claims in metaphysics are sterile, and it's only a repetition which comes again and again. Scientists were also very relieved that now philosophy was not there to legislate, because earlier, after religion, there was this whole idea that now philosophers will become more important, but the scientists were very thrilled that now we don't have to deal with the religious people, and we don't have to deal with philosophers, so thank God they are out. One big thing, of course, which these people were bringing forth, and which I think is of great importance, is clarity. And they were saying clarity is the final purpose of philosophizing, and they were opposing it to something what they called wooliness. So once you attain clarity, then you are able to clearly say that this is over this and that is one. And that was like the story which you all read as little children about the Emperor's New Clothes. The story which was written by Hans Andersen, where that little child says ki, bhai, वो लोग बेवकूफ़ बना रहे थे राजा को कि हम तुम्हारे कपड़े बना रहे हैं सोने चांदी के, और वो वीव कर रहे थे और राजा जाके झांकता था और वो करते थे, देयर वाज नथिंग, एंड फाइनली ही कम्स आउट wearing those clothes, and he's wearing nothing, but the child says, oh, the emperor is wearing no clothes. So now the philosophers of the analytic persuasion, especially the logical positivists who were saying that now we have got the principle of right, correct insight, that there are only two kinds of statements, either they are empirically verifiable or they are analytic. They were saying that now we are actually telling कि जो तुम्हारी बरसों पुरानी emperor का जो कपड़े थे वो कोई कपड़े नहीं थे. So emperor is wearing no clothes. So they had that great kind of courage and honesty, is the way they thought of themselves. It's also interesting that the communists and the Nazis also banned it. The point is that the verification theory, of course, which you will read and you must have read part of it, was never completely free from difficulties, and it was never very properly articulated. And many people thought that reduction does not really work. Statements of logic are analytic. This is also doubtful. Are statements of logic analytical? And the major attack which you are going to see came from Quine's two dogmas of empiricism. Clarity is of course important, but the whole question was that, is it enough, and is it all that you have? So here was a revolution, and there was a revolutionary purpose, and philosophy now again. But what is the role of philosophy now with philosophical analysis? There's an old question, is philosophy the queen of all sciences or the handmaiden? Rani hai ki नौकरानी है? तो हम लोग मानते कि नौकरानी है भाई, लोग कूड़ा फैलाते हैं और हम लोग उसको साफ करते हैं. It is intellectual cobwebs, confusions, misrepresentations. रोज़ बच्चे ख़ासतौर से बदमाश लड़के अपने गंदे गंदे कपड़े फेंक जाते हैं, उनको हम लोग फिर समेटते हैं, साफ करते हैं, रखते हैं. So the task of philosophy is that of the handmaiden, but then I heard some very interesting thing that handmaiden भी दो तरह की हो सकती है. एक तो handmaiden वो होती है जो पीछे पीछे आपके चलती है और आपके कपड़ों की ट्रेल लेके चलती है, और एक handmaiden वो होती है जो आगे आपको मशाल लेके रास्ता दिखाती है. तो हम सिर्फ झाड़ू लगाने वाली handmaiden है कि मशाल दिखाने वाले हैं, ये भी बात देखी जा सकती है. But this was again somehow or the other taking a secondary role and saying that science as an investigation into the nature of reality will be the main thing, and all knowledge was actually taken over by science. And what do philosophers do? They will analyze or criticize theories which are concepts used in science. Logic will be used as a tool, and centuries after Aristotle, Boole and De Morgan, they come, and then you have Russell, Whitehead, Frege, Schroeder, Peirce, and as I was mentioning yesterday, Ayer thinks that Ernst Mach is a very important figure. Albert Einstein, his new science, and these are all important figures. So Einstein is to say that you cannot attach sense to a notion like simultaneity unless you consider how statements about simultaneity are to be verified. So how do you determine a statement where simultaneity is being spoken of? So how is it determined in observation? This was seen as a vindication of a philosophical theory, because even in Einstein this is what was seen. So no meaning is attached to a particle having a precise velocity and precise position, because it cannot be tested as the observer disturbs. Scientific concepts mean what they do by the way they are verified. So any scientific concept is actually understood in terms of the way it is functioning. And so the positivists thought that science is on our side, and all philosophical problems are either senseless or solved by purely logical techniques. So there were three positive doctrines which they were giving. One, meaning of a proposition is the method of its verification. Meaning of a proposition is the method of verification, and empirical verifiability was the main thing, no metaphysics. Here I think it's a very major thing. ये एक बहुत बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है बाहर भी यहाँ पे भी कि सब लोग ये इन लोगों का सबका ये मानना था कि मेटाफिजिक्स का मतलब है आइडियलिज्म, और आइडियलिज्म को रिजेक्ट कर दिया तो मेटाफिजिक्स को रिजेक्ट कर दिया. भाई आइडियलिज्म को रिजेक्ट करके आप क्या लाए? रियलिज्म लाए. रियलिज्म भी तो ये कह रही है कि व्हाट इज द नेचर ऑफ रियलिटी. तो मेटाफिजिक्स का मतलब तो ये होता है कि दोज क्वेश्चंस व्हिच गिव यू एन आंसर टू द क्वेश्चन व्हाट इज द नेचर ऑफ रियलिटी. If you are saying it is of the nature of consciousness, you are an idealist. If you are saying not so, then you are a realist. But in both cases, you are giving a metaphysical account. How is it that a rejection of idealism is seen as a rejection of metaphysics? So propositions of mathematics and logic were seen as necessarily true, and in the Kantian framework, they were supposed to be analytical. And this, I think, as you were reading and I was sharing it with you, is also not very Kantian. Many people had understood, including Descartes, that the certainty in logic is actually bought at a very heavy cost. Logic is necessary because it tells you nothing about the world. Mathematics is absolutely certain because it tells you nothing about the world. So the cost of certainty, necessity, is the cost borne by it being factually vacuous. So this is not something which came because everybody was, okay, everything should be like mathematics, absolutely certain. Absolutely certain, but it gives you nothing. And this is what Descartes and later Russell also understand very late in lives. And the third thing which they are saying is that philosophy is an act of elucidation, clarifying and analyzing, exposing nonsense in some cases. So these are the three things which the positivists were. There is a very interesting set of interviews which you all must see. It is also printed. These are interviews by Brian Magee. And there is an interview which Magee is asking questions to A.J. Ayer. And A.J. Ayer says that Schlick, Ernst Mach and Wittgenstein thought that we can translate all sentences into statements about sense data. The immediate data of observation. But this was never achieved. And it runs into many difficulties. Now, what are the difficulties that you have? सारे sentences को हम sense data में reduce कर सकते हैं. ये वाला जो enthusiasm था, what are the difficulties with it? Some of the difficulties are one, like how do you take a universal statement? All crows are black. This is a universal statement. All gases expand when heated. This is a scientific general statement. Now the range of it is infinite. Will there be ever a stage when you can claim that I have seen all crows? You can't. So is this statement verified, verifiable? It is neither verified nor verifiable because the term all as its scope is open-ended and refers to an infinity. Similarly about all gases. So you can't translate them into sentences of the variety which are confirmed or disconfirmed by empirical observation of sense objects. Now, how do you resolve that? So one of the answers which Moritz looked at, that instead of taking this statement that all ravens are black and all gases expand when heated, they should not be treated like statements, but they should be treated like rules. So they are not statements at all which are true or false, but they are rules, because rules are not true or false. Rules are followed or not followed, accepted or not accepted, but they are not true or false. But will everybody accept that? And what is the implication of that? Because when you make a statement in the Aristotelian framework, all crows are black, from that the other thing that you can imply is that at least some crows are black. Now some crows are black is definitely verifiable. So converting that statement into a rule will have that from the rule the other thing will not imply. So what you thought is a good solution is actually going to create a certain kind of a disturbance in other rules of implication in the traditional logic. So you will have to change that as well. Then the high level statements about atoms, nucleus, electrons. Now can you write them in terms of sense data and sense impression? Can you see an atom? You can't. You call it an electron microscope, but does the electron microscope show electrons? It can't. So all your statements about atoms, electrons, waves, etc., they cannot be translated into statements about sense data. So I see this as a blue thing. Now this sentence and a statement that this blueness comes to me because of the particles in motion, but the particles in motion and my translation into it are two different things. One cannot be translated into it. So the concept of verification or verification through sense data and sense experience had to be weakened. You cannot be translating one out into the other. कि आपने एक ऐसा translation करा जिसमें कि पूरा का पूरा दूसरी चीज explain होगी. You cannot translate it out. So confirmation by experience of sense observation, and the meaning then becomes now partially undetermined, and there is again what you may call ambiguity, confusion, vagueness. So not only is there trouble with statements of the general nature or statements about electrons, protons and certain other things, but what about statements of the past? Alexander came to India, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So if you look at history back, can they be translated into statements of sense experience? It seems very strange. So Ayer seems to withdraw his view by the time he is being interviewed by Brian Maggie. Also statements about other minds. Are my statements about other people and their minds only statements about their behavior? So again, the verification principle has to be weakened. Similarly, one of the biggest challenge which came for the positivists was in terms of moral judgments. Are statements about morality, are they statements about the world or not? And at one time, some people said that no, our statements of morality can be converted into statements about what we want, and they are related to our desires. So some kind of a rough utilitarian account was given. And as you know, जो आप लोगों ने ethics में पढ़ा है, many people said that they are actually like statements of commands. The Vienna Circle, of course, made it possible for philosophers to become self-conscious of their activity. कि हम क्या कर रहे हैं? What is it that we are doing? More vindicated the common sense and said that what it is true. And both the positivists as well as the Cambridge analysts and the Vienna Circle emphasized on analysis. So philosophers were serving science by making concepts more precise. Philosophy is seen as a second order activity. First order subjects are talking about the world. The second order was talking about the talk about the world. And Gilbert Ryle has a very interesting term for that, talk about talk. So philosophy is talk about talk. It is, as I was mentioning yesterday, there were many people who say that but this is nothing new. This is as old as the history of philosophy. Socrates is also talking about language. He's talking about, Plato is asking, what is the meaning of courage? What is the meaning of justice? What is the meaning of perception? And they did not see that when you are asking for meaning, you are only asking a verbal question. In retrospect, they can be seen as questions about what is meant by them. Of course, Russell, Wittgenstein, when they are talking about language, they are talking about it in a more definitive way. And if you are trying to look at some other philosophers apart from the ancients, then if you are looking at Hobbes, for instance, or Locke, they are also talking about science. And also when you are looking at certain philosophers of the pragmatic tradition like Charles Peirce, they are also talking about it. If philosophy is talking about language, then is it far away from the world? That is also not true, because language is also a part of the world. Therefore, through talk about language, you are also talking about the world. The world as we describe it. So, when we are asking a question, what is causality? We are asking a question about the world. But how does Hume analyze this? Bataiye? How does Hume analyze it? Causality ki analysis, how does Hume do that? Atif? So if you are asking him the question that what is causality, then he is saying, what do we generally mean when we make a sentence of the variety A is the cause of B? And then he says that when we say that something A is the cause of B, we mean that A is coming before B. Yeah. It is spatially and temporally contiguous with B. We also want to say that it is an invariable concomitance. Whenever A comes, it is followed by B. And apart, so there is spatio-temporal priority, there is temporal priority, spatio-temporal contiguity, and the third thing that we say is that it is a necessary connection between A and B. So whenever I say A is the cause of B, this is what I mean. And then in the analysis he says that you can observe that A is close to B in space and time. You can also observe that A always comes before B, but you cannot observe that there is a necessary connection between them, because that is not a part of observation. But what Ayer and the others are trying to call your attention to, that the sentence, that the analysis of causality has now taken a linguistic form. So what is causality? So instead of satkaryam, satkaryevad, asatkaryevad, now you are talking about how do you analyze a sentence where you say A is the cause of B. So language is being used, but language is not being studied for its own sake. It would be sterile. The structure of language is being studied because you are believing that the structure of language is going to give you the structure of the world. That's the kind of a thing that you find particularly in the picture theory of meaning. Now, how are the categories of analytic, a priori and necessary related to each other? That is something which is very important. And when we study Quine's essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, many new dimensions are added, and then many years later, somewhere around the 80s, Saul Kripke gave the John Locke lectures, I think 82, 83, which are called Naming and Necessity lectures, where he again re-questions the idea of analytic, a priori, necessary, and then many other people join him like Saul Kripke, Hilary Putnam, and many other scholars. So what we will do then, tomorrow onwards, we will try and see what is Quine saying, and how is Quine giving his theory about the rejection of the analytic synthetic distinction. That's what we will do, right? So far what we have done as a background to Two Dogmas of Empiricism, tried to develop some kind of a rough and ready understanding of the history and characteristics of analytical philosophy. Philosophical analysis and its history, of course, as we saw repeatedly, it comes with the background of rejection of mainly the idealism of his times. And when Russell is talking about analysis, it is, as I mentioned, that he never really comes up with a very clear definition of what he means by analysis. It is clear from his uses of the term that he conceives it as a form of definition, either real or contextual, non-linguistic as well as linguistic. And are there real definitions as Aristotle believed, or there are nominal definitions? This is something. So what is the ultimate constitution of reality or certain aspects of life? These are perennial problems, and Russell, many of his books also use the term analysis as part of its title. Like one very famous work of Russell is called The Analysis of Mind. And there he is trying to find somewhat a contextual definition of the psychological terms. But then in many cases he is talking about true analysis, complete analysis. Sometimes he calls it faulty analysis. Now in all of that there does seem to be that he is more Aristotelian than not, and this is a trouble with Russell. Again, he has a long productive period, much like Richard Rorty, for 40-50 years of writing. Russell writes for a shorter while, but Rorty writes for 50 years. But there again, at least 5 different meanings of the term philosophy, 5 different meanings of analysis, etc. come. To get a good glimpse of what Moore has to say about analysis, I think it would be a good idea for you to go to, there is a book which was published in 1942 which is called Philosophy of G.E. Moore. In that, My Philosophy and Critics, in that Moore gives replies, and he will give you a very good answer to the question what he means by analysis. There are many followers which we find of Moore and Russell. Wittgenstein, early Wittgenstein seems to be one. John Wisdom seems to be the other, as I mentioned. Gilbert Ryle talks about, is again in the same school. And then, as we mentioned, we have logical positivism, in which we have many people, including A.J. Ayer. And then we have people who reject analysis. Let me put one small thing which I think may be useful to conclude today's very broad talk, and that is, that in the past few years, what has been the challenge? And John Searle considers that from 1950s to 60s, it is a period where many challenges come to the idea of analytical philosophy. The first is Quine's attack on analytical synthetic distinction. The second is J.L. Austin's theory of speech acts, because he says that language, it does not mean only writing. He thinks that actually understanding language should be a part of understanding action, and that to intentional action. So then all of it becomes a part of philosophy of mind. Language performs, according to him, 5 major functions: assertive, directive, commissive, expressive, and declarative. Then he also speaks about the distinction, performatives and constitutives. So all of that. So this whole discussion of Austin becomes very, very important, and then puts the whole idea of a very simplistic idea of understanding language into trouble. The third big challenge, according to Searle, comes from Wittgenstein's writing, which is his rejection of foundationalism, that there are different language games and there are different forms of life, and language performs different functions. Another very interesting thing about which I think is very, very curious is that 1971, John Rawls comes up with one of the most historic works of the century, A Theory of Justice, and where he talks about political institutions without bothering about whether philosophers can make first order theories about political institutions. So he headlong starts talking about the first order activity. That's one major thing. And then the positivist philosophy of science, especially when it comes to the very, very dramatic figure of Thomas Kuhn. 1962 he writes The Structure of Scientific Revolution. In 1975 then Feyerabend comes again against method, that there is no single method of doing philosophy. So these people come up with questions to scientific theory, and Thomas Kuhn sometimes seems to say that there is no real world independent theory, which is of course problematic. And Searle thinks that now philosophy is more synoptic and logically oriented, but less sealed off from other disciplines. So you look at the Blackwell Companion 2003, then you find many of these things. So now, after the criticism of philosophical analysis and taking into cognizance these changes, now people are saying that we have 5 major areas of philosophical research. 1, cognitive science. 2, causal theory of reference. 3, intentionalist theory of meaning. 4, truth conditional theories of meaning. And 5, Wittgenstein's legacy on rules of philosophical psychology and skepticism. So this is more or less a rather concise, crude background in terms of which we are going to read 2 Dogmas of Empiricism of Quine, because that is what I was supposed to teach and that's what I'm going to teach. But this is the rough and ready background in terms of which we can now look at that. So tomorrow onwards we will start looking at 2 Dogmas of Empiricism, right?